Well, on this episode of MSU Today, we're going to discuss the implementation of MSU Strategic Plan 2030. We're going to do so with Bill Beekman. Bill is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at MSU, and one of his chief responsibilities is to oversee the implementation of MSU Strategic Plan 2030. Bill, great to have you back on the program.
Well, thanks so much, Russ. Really very much appreciate it.
And before we invite in our guest today, just refresh our memory a little bit of the history of the plan. It was started under President Stanley. Interim President Woodruff embraced it. Just again, why was it necessary? Sort of where are we? How has it evolved so far?
Well, that's absolutely right, Russ. We started the strategic plan in 19. Sometimes it feels that way. In 2019 and 2020, with a lengthy planning process that involved much of the campus community. The plan was endorsed by the Board of Trustees at its meeting in September of 2021. And we've been off to the races implementing 6 theme areas since that time. And, we in prior decades, generations had sort of looser plans, but this is really MSU's first strategic plan in some time that has embraced developing specific objectives with goals, with benchmarks and metrics that we're tracking. And so it's very exciting to see progress in so many areas. One of our theme areas is stewardship and sustainability. Objective 2 of that theme area was the development of a comprehensive land use and facilities plan. And so very, very excited to have our guest with us today to talk about that.
And let's invite Steve Troost into the conversation. Steve is a campus planner with infrastructure planning and facilities. Steve, welcome back to the program, and looking forward to your conversation with Bill here.
So, Steve, first of all, tell us, what does a campus planner do? Tell us a little bit about your role here at Michigan State, how long you've been here, how it's evolved, and what you're doing now.
Bill, my lineage would go back to the class of '82 when I graduated from the landscape architecture program. Then went out into the world, and I spent about 20 years in private practice doing campus plans for institutions across the country. When the campus plan back in 2000 was approved by the Board of Trustees, the idea was to have a campus planner as a permanent position. So I embraced it. I came back to my alma mater, and I've been with the university now 18 years. What does a campus planner do? I think the key objective of a campus planner is to hold things together. There are a lot of great ideas out there in a higher ed institution. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing is embracing the highest and best use of our facilities and land so that we can continue to be the strategic and global leader that we are.
Well, and I think people think of us as an academic institution doing research and teaching students, and of course those are our key roles. But really, Michigan State is a I was going to say a small city. It's actually probably in this state a medium-sized sort of municipality with its own police department, its own water infrastructure. The fire services come from East Lansing but are embedded within our campus. We have roads that are our responsibility. So there's just so much infrastructure here that it really is planning for a medium-sized municipality in the state.
Absolutely.
So you've been leading this planning process for the university's comprehensive facilities and land use plan. We're calling it Vision 2050, which seems like looking really far ahead into the future. Although 25 years, I suppose, is in some ways a long ways away, and in other ways probably the day after tomorrow it'll feel like. But tell us a little bit about what a facilities and land use plan is. What are the kinds of things that are incorporated into that plan? What are you planning for?
Bill, the 2050 date is magical, right? We don't have a crystal ball that goes out beyond almost a year. We have a pretty good idea with our capital outlay to the state what projects are in the mix of priorities, what are things that we would like to achieve if we had the funds and resources to do so. But we really can only plan out about 5 years. What we challenged this process to do, this is the Vision 2050 Strategic Land Use and Facilities Plan, is to look comprehensively at the capacity of this campus to grow over time. So we identify opportunities for growth. We don't dictate growth in the plan. That all comes from the faculty and staff and the administration on what they want to see happen. But we have an idea for if the campus should grow, this is how we want it to be physically organized. And we want to do that so that we understand capacities. We don't put a project where later on it becomes an impediment to something else. We want to make sure we're providing a safe environment that leads into some of the strategic themes. We want to make sure that we are using our land to its highest and best use. And we want to be efficient in how the campus is laid out so operationally we can keep our operational costs minimized.
So you mentioned the other themes in our strategic plan, and in addition to the theme that this project is a part of, stewardship and sustainability, we have student success, staff and faculty success, research growth. We have a health care pillar, and then a diversity, equity, and inclusion theme area. How does the plan affect and impact those other 5 theme areas of our strategic plan?
Yep. We started out with those strategic themes, the 6 themes that were out there. I think we focused quite a bit on student success and faculty staff success. But then if you look at innovation for a global impact, how do our facilities and our lands leverage that ability? Sustainable health is another aspect. Stewardship and sustainability, obviously how we use the land in our facilities is critical. And then diversity, equity, inclusion. I was surprised at how we could find then overarching planning principles that tied to each of those. And we put a matrix together with the consultants we hired, Sasaki and Associates. And we looked at how each of those strategic themes would blend into our planning principles. And those are overarching, right? So those endear things like empowering a Spartan United mindset, using making sure that the university's mission drives the physical change on campus. Things should tie back to mission. Advancing excellence in teaching, learning, and research. We want to make sure we've got those modern state-of-the-art facilities that let our brilliant people do their brilliant work. We want to foster a more inclusive and welcoming campus climate. We want to make sure that there's equity in how people can access their education. We want to make sure we're enhancing connectivity, engagement, and institutional identity. That starts to broaden us across the state. With 26,000 acres of land, that includes East Lansing, 30 major ag bio research stations, and an extension present in every county. It's critical that we make sure our brand and our resources are being coordinated and leveraged across the state. We want to cultivate a living and learning ecosystem. For example, we have 3,000 acres of agricultural land south of Mount Hope Road here in East Lansing. A lot of people see that as wide open land for future development. It's critical that it be protected and used and leveraged for our teaching and research mission.
Dean Millenbaugh in our College of Agriculture and Natural Resources would say that land is, although it may appear to many of us as though it is just sort of vacant, untread farm fields, that it's of critical value to their research and their activities. So
absolutely.
So, which raises an interesting question. So many universities are in fairly urban areas, and as a result are fairly landlocked. And Michigan State, at least in the universities I've traveled to around the country, feels a bit unique in that we do have a pretty significant land footprint. Now, as you mentioned, those many of the fields that we perceive as vacant are really being put to use for important agricultural work. But I think it does cause an interesting question, the degree to which one sort of builds up or builds out. Do we want to think about the main campus the next building, maybe another building where we'd have office space and student classrooms and that kind of thing to be 6 or 8 stories? Or would we rather be building 1 and 2 story buildings? And how do you think about that kind of issue? Sort of in a city, you might think of it as the urban core versus the suburbs, and you'd think of it as a zoning plan. And I suspect we have our own version of a zoning plan. But how do you think about that up versus out question?
Yeah, back under President Hanna, the university established its own zoning ordinance, so it's self-imposed and we self-regulate. It does get into the idea that in certain parts of campus, we want to have a density that's appropriate. So you could imagine north of the river in our historic campus, we try to limit our buildings to 3 to 4 stories. We don't want to see a lot of dense urban. We want to maintain that campus park concept that is critical to our identity. You come south of the river, and you can, for example, see around the FRIB, the development density increases, the building heights increase, and that's because we're doing strategic research and there's collaboration that occurs by that. The urban planner in me would say we want to use our land to its highest and best ability. We want to have a mix of uses. We don't want to segregate. And we want to make sure that we've got an appropriate density. For example, when you have to change classes and you've got to get from a Brody Hall all the way down to a life sciences complex, that's a trouble. And we got to make sure that we keep those academic districts dense and capable for students to be able to make that transition during the day. By keeping the campus compact, we also allow for that collaboration, right? The atoms that bounce around inside of a small confined space are very active as opposed to those that float around and have places to move. So we want to make sure that we've allowed for that collaboration, the chance encounter, the student-faculty mentoring. We want those to happen. So we do follow our zoning ordinance. We want to make sure we're providing an appropriate urban scale for our campus. And if you look at the campus plan, it identifies aspirationally 27 million gross square feet of future opportunity. That's net new. That includes taking down some of our old tired buildings that need to go. We have 25 million gross square feet today. We won't double the campus density in our time, but it gives the capacity challenge. We know how we want the campus organized, so as ideas come forward and projects come forward, we can assimilate them into the campus fabric. We also want to use that for our utility planning. Critical issue, energy. And so how we then distribute across campus. If you have a sprawled campus, you have a lot more infrastructure that you've got to maintain. A fun example, we have enough sidewalks to stretch from campus to the shores of Lake Michigan, if you put them end to end. We need to make sure that we keep the campus in a compact nature so that we can operationally be efficient, but strive for those student, faculty, staff successes that we're trying to get out of the campus plan.
Well, and that was one of the fascinating aspects of planning that I discovered in a prior role working with the Board of Trustees, is that when we think about where a building's going to go, sort of a layperson like me is that, well, there's an open space, we could build a building there. But you have to think very carefully about, for example, the load of the power grid, and do we have sufficient power through the network that we've currently built that can power that particular building. And for some buildings, for a classroom building where you're mostly powering lights and computers and air conditioning and heating, that's one sort of load level. But thinking about an FRIB building is a completely different load level with the extraordinary amount of power it takes to sort of shoot atoms through the air at high speeds. So when we think about the next research building or the next classroom building or residence hall or whatever it might be, what you're saying is that there's a plan in place that doesn't say it must go here, but that might say here are options that we've thought about for where that building would naturally fit, such that the power grid is taken into consideration. traffic and safety for pedestrians, bicyclists, motor vehicle drivers is taken into consideration, and the aesthetic and beauty of the campus is taken into consideration. So all those different aspects, and I'm sure I'm missing a few, go into thinking about where that next building might go.
Yeah, no, Bill, you're spot on. The campus plan provides us a flexible framework so that we can adapt to institutional needs over time. We should begin every project's planning process, with the programming study and site evaluations. So we look at what the program is trying to do, how big is the bread box, what academic synergies might want to be around it. A good poster child for that is Wells Hall. When we had to take down Morrill Hall, we needed to move the English units that were in there and the mathematics, right? We were looking at sites around the center of our campus, proximal to Morrill Hall, where we already had those units at some level. We couldn't figure out exact sites. It was that administration at the time, I'll give credit to President Simon, who said we can close down those workhorse classrooms, which everyone relied on, and we can build up and over that highest and best use of our land rather than moving on. So yeah, we need to look at all of those projects, do site assessments to understand what's the best opportunity, not just for the use of the land, but also for the academic synergies.
And I would challenge our listeners that may not have been around a decade ago to go look at Wells Hall. And it really is fascinating because it looks so naturally integrated today. But to think that originally there was sort of a tower on the south end and some larger spaces on the north end, but that middle section was all one floor. And to see the building that essentially was built on top of that building, up and over and around it, is really quite spectacular. But it did keep those functions in the center of campus, and allowed us to take down Morrill Hall. That I remember when I was a student walking through that building, you could sort of bounce down the hallway because the floorboards would just sort of had a sponginess to them. So it's amazing. You hate to take down those old buildings, but on the one hand, on the other, it's amazing that it lasted as long as it did.
Well, and to your point, too, about the systems of campus, every project needs to. I'm a systems thinker. That's how I was taught to do campus planning when I was in the private sector. You look at exactly what you said. You were spot on. You look at where the buildings ought to be organized, how the open space should move and network through the campus, how vehicular circulation should work. That includes parking. What about non-motorized circulation? And then you've got your utilities and distribution networks. All of those need to be looked at almost individually and then overlaid on each other to see if there's conflicts or where there can be areas for support.
So I'll ask sort of the $64,000 question on a university campus. How do you look at parking going forward? It seems as though if you're a faculty member, maybe the number one concern is research space and lab space and infrastructure. If you're everybody else, it seems like the number one concern is where am I going to park and how might our traffic patterns around campus change in the years and decades to come.
Well, we've got a scientific experiment in process today, right? The Farm Lane Bridge being reconstructed, no vehicular traffic. So they went over and modified the Spartan intersection because we needed to understand how traffic would be trying to move to get to those vehicular parking lots, especially the visitor lots. And it's problematic at certain times of the day. The planner in me would say we have to have parking, and we have plenty of parking compared to our peers, and it's relatively inexpensive relative to our peers. So we're fortunate there. We also have what the campus traffic planners would tell me is a hunting license. You can move your car anytime during the day around campus, and what that does is it drives vehicular congestion. We have a safe campus, mind you. We don't have many accidents. So what we need to do is we need to balance where parking is, again, that highest and best use of land. Let's pick on the center of campus at Shawn Farm. 1,000 surface parking spaces occupy our geographic center of our campus. more students move through that area of campus via foot power on any given day. Right proximal to that is the CATA Transit Center on campus. We have 1,000 parked cars. We don't have a quadrangle. We don't have an open space. I mean, we have that north of the river, but that's no longer the geographic center of campus where students are trying to move to classes. So we need to understand that. And the campus plan that we've developed here talks about a long-term transition where those 1,000 cars would move farther away over by the intersection of Red Cedar and Wilson. And then we would allow for the redevelopment of that land for academic and research buildings. So we need to have it. It needs to be proximal, but we need to think about the highest and best use of our land, as well as how do we incentivize the use of transit. You know, transit's used very well by the students. I don't think that the faculty and staff much use it much. And I think we also need to think about a suite of options for mobility. It isn't just the car, it isn't just the pedestrian, it isn't just the bicycle, but we need to have that suite of options that can encourage somebody to possibly take a bus to campus and then rely upon other modes to move around the campus, be it the scooters that we see today or the mopeds that we used to see. Not saying those are the answer, but if somebody can get to campus without bringing their car and then have the ability to move around it, we can begin to change that mindset. But we have a lot of resources that are legacy. And over time, I think land pressures will change and we'll start to re-look at those things. And then, of course, what will the future be? Will we have autonomous vehicles flying around? Is that more or less traffic? Well, nobody's answered that one for me. But the car is here to stay for some time. And we need to continue to just plan for the transition in accordance with the land use plan.
Well, and I think that's why having a plan is so important. There are so many unknowns. What will vehicular transportation look like 10, 20, 30 years from now? I was having lunch with a faculty member who's a mobility specialist in the College of Engineering who was talking about, well, what if we had sort of ubiquitous driverless vehicles 10, 20 years from now? You wouldn't need to own a car. You could just sort of summon a car kind of in the way that you summon an Uber, but it might just be a driverless vehicle that you could access at a very inexpensive price. Maybe you had a co-ownership arrangement with a collective of people. So all these sort of ideas that don't feel particularly science fictionish. They feel pretty possible. And certainly, as the pandemic has taught us, on our campus, many people still work at least part of the time from home. We found that in many situations that works. I mean, obviously, the cooks in the residence halls, you can't cook from home, but many other roles can have a more of a hybrid model. Do you see that having affected our campus? I mean, as you think about the Farm Lane Bridge closing and traffic patterns, have we noticed less park? I can't imagine that we've noticed less parking issues, but has the sort of outcome or the shadow of the pandemic impacted how you think about planning?
It does. While we're seeing the pendulums shift a little bit back more towards in person, I mean, there's lots of different ways to get an education out there, right? But people come to Michigan State University because they want to come to campus. They want to be able to interact. That social aspect is as much of that learning outcome as many of the things in the classroom. We have seen, for example, a lot of excessive office space. We have more office space than we need. There are certain functions that will likely stay virtual. Many of the HR functions and accounting functions that can be done, virtually will probably remain that way, with some coming to campus. What we learned when we were doing the engagement sessions for this plan was that, especially the faculty and staff, they wanted to come to campus so that they could collaborate. And they need to be able to come and be in person, and that ability to bounce ideas off of each other is more problematic virtually. So we will see a change in that. Relative to parking, there was a decrease in demand, even in the center of campus, which is our peak parking area. Obviously, where we have some of these office functions on the edges of campus, those parking lots have a lot of capacity. We might have to start thinking about, can we incentivize people to park a little further away, get on a bus and come into the center of campus, and then incentivize that so that people will want to take that idea, along with the ability to provide for emergency needs. You got a kid that's sick, you got to get to a doctor's office. Those things can be there. So we again, that goes back to the whole concept of the flexible framework. This is how ideally we would like the campus to be physically organized, and then we can respond to these changes as they come forward and materialize. I think the university is getting its next autonomous bus here. I think it'll be operational soon. The idea of remote parking lots, down on Mount Hope Road and then getting on a bus line up Farm Lane into the center of campus. If you knew that was there and reliable and it was on a set schedule and you could have accommodations where it's warm to wait in the wintertime, I think people would start to embrace that, especially if that price differential begins to set a difference.
I totally agree. I think when you look at how, for example, Disney World down in Florida operates, and people find ways to get around without their vehicles, and but if it's exactly as you described, very reliable, every 10 minutes there's going to be a bus at this stop, and if it's 10 below, there's a shelter where I can stay at least a little warmer, and it's significantly less expensive than parking in the center of campus, which, as you mentioned, parking feels expensive, and yet when we survey other Big Ten campuses, we're about the best deal in the conference. One of the other things I think it's important to share is that those parking fees very directly go back to our parking system, cover the cost of maintaining the lots, maintaining the ramps, and the periodic work that needs to occur on those, and so on. We've talked a lot about the main campus here in East Lansing, but this plan also is a plan for the broader Michigan State footprint that exists in Grand Rapids, in Flint, in many counties around the state through our extension offices. How do we think about planning on a statewide basis in addition to the massive infrastructure we have here in East Lansing?
Good question. With nearly 21,000 acres across the state, as I mentioned, 30 major ag bio research stations and a presence in every county from our extension group. It's important to understand that next to people, and it's a far next, but next to people, land is one of our most strategic resources, especially with the work we do in our agriculture and natural sciences fields. What was eye-opening to me, for example, was the work we did out at Kellogg Biological Station. We looked at their resources, their land, their facilities, and they need some investments in their facilities. And they, to some degree, felt like a bit of a stepchild, right? We focus on East Lansing, and yet they're doing critical research, especially as you look at climate change, crop resiliency, and how will farmers adapt to the future. I think another important piece is to understand that much of our research that occurs off of the East Lansing campus is community-based. Yes. So these researchers are working with the communities they're embedded in, for example, Flint in the water, to work on those specific issues that are relevant to them. We have three critical hubs, as you mentioned: Grand Rapids with its health sciences. We've got Flint with its research and centered on some of the water issues. Then we got Detroit. We've got hundreds of initiatives at over 1,000 locations throughout that metropolitan area. Many people say we're in Detroit. Are we in Detroit? We are in Detroit. We've been in Detroit for decades, but they're doing community-based research that's appropriate for what those communities are trying to deal with. And so I think that's important. So we need these resources across the state to understand that. Now, From a planning perspective, we can look and we can work with them if they have new facilities coming in. We do get involved in review of like the expansion of the Flint Journal building for that program. IPF is that's infrastructure planning of facilities is involved in managing that. The new project with the Pistons and Henry Ford Health down in Detroit is a huge research endeavor, and it's being led by our people here in East Lansing. We deal with it just like we do here on East Lansing, though. The ideas come from the brilliant people that we have working for us, and then we work to figure out what's required to leverage that new idea.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the perspective of our new president. Dr. Guskowitz has referred to Michigan State as the university for Michigan. And I think that reflects, Steve, exactly what you've been saying. You know, in a way, the university for Greater Lansing, but also for Flint and for Grand Rapids and for Detroit and for all of those areas around the state in both the Upper and Lower Peninsula where we have extension offices, experiment stations, and, you know, as you said earlier, literally activity in every county in the state of Michigan. Well, we'll wrap up with hopefully a fun question. What couple of things might really surprise our listeners about this plan? Are there any things that came out of this process that just caused you to think, "Wow, I'd have never thought of that," or "That's really unique," or people might not be aware of some aspect of how our campus works?
Well, Bill, maybe we could begin looking at the process itself, right? So it was almost a 2-year horizon to get this plan across the finish line. We had virtual campus mapping exercises when we started. It allowed for over 880 participants to give us over 11,000 comments. So they went online, They marked the campus, things they liked, didn't like, needed work, those types of things. That gave the planning team a really good boost. We had personal and group listening sessions with over 660 of our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and community members, as well as administrators. We had open houses within each phase of the project. So as the plan was evolving, people could come to the open houses and they could give their input. And then we had a dedicated website that allowed for asynchronous input throughout that 2-year process. That surprised me that there were that many Spartans passionate about this campus and the ideas they had going forward. Are the issues much different? I don't think so. You know, you mentioned it, parking. That's always important. Vehicular circulation, congestion. Again, as I've mentioned, and our traffic engineer, Stephanie O'Donnell, will tell me we have a safe campus, Steve. We don't have a lot of critical issues, and that's a good thing. But we need to work on that congestion and minimizing times when there is the conflict between the pedestrian and the automobile. I was also maybe not surprised, but it reinforced the passion people had for the open space and the campus park.
Yes.
Again, when Hannah established the zoning ordinance back decades ago, it was to protect the campus park. Buildings could be so high, they could take over so much land, they could be so close to the street. That was all in preservation of that campus park, because that open space is what intertwines and interlinks and brings things together.
And it's this time of year when you really appreciate that, as we begin to get the occasional 70-degree day, and you drive around campus or take a walk and discover students out with a blanket on the lawn, studying, reading, relaxing. And one of the things I miss about our switch to semesters is, when back in the day, the academic year ran into mid-June almost, and it was so much fun being here when the weather was so nice. And our current students lose a little bit of that by wrapping up around the 1st of May. But nevertheless, Steve, I can't thank you enough for joining us. Our university is such a special place with researchers working tirelessly to solve the world's thorniest problems, and yet I think there's probably an underappreciation for the layers and layers and layers of infrastructure and people who work to make sure that the water, the gas, the air come into that lab, that everything works, that the researcher has a parking space, that the instructor has a working classroom with the appropriate technology to teach students in the appropriate way. And so as one of the critical people on our campus who leads so much of that work, thank you for being here and sharing a bit of that with us.
Yes, Bill. Now, it takes a village. It truly does take a village. And I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that while I was one of the leaders of this plan, it was in partnership with Ms. Barb's Kranz, who is our assistant provost for institutional space planning and management. How all of that works, it's huge. You know, as I mentioned, 25 million gross square feet. We are a big place.
Yeah. But with a rock star like Barb and Steve, with your work and such a wonderful team, it all comes together and makes us better. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've been discussing the Comprehensive Facilities and Land Use Plan, which is part of the Stewardship and Sustainability theme in MSU Strategic Plan 2030. Steve Troost was our guest. He's a campus planner in infrastructure planning and facilities. Bill Beekman is our vice president for strategic initiatives and really oversees the implementation of this living and breathing plan. Much more online simply at strategicplan.msu.edu. And I'm Russ White. This is MSU Today.